Once a symbol of middle-class stability, the American suburb is now under growing financial strain. Rising home prices, higher interest rates, and escalating costs for healthcare, education, and transportation have reshaped suburban life into a constant balancing act. Even households with stable incomes face shrinking margins, forcing families to adapt through dual earners, longer commutes, side work, or delayed life milestones. This analysis explores how inflation, wage stagnation, and shifting labor markets intersect with suburban cost structures, revealing an economy where survival increasingly depends on flexibility rather than security, and where middle-class stability is no longer guaranteed. The American retirement was once a choreographed three-act play. You worked, you collected a gold watch, and you spent 20 years perfecting your golf swing on a fixed company pension. In the pre-crisis era, this social contract was anchored by defined benefit plans that promised a predictable monthly check until the end of time. The macro indicators painted a picture of terminal stability. GDP growth was a steady heartbeat, and the three-legged stool of Social Security, private pensions, and personal savings seemed structurally sound. However, beneath this calm surface, a massive structural pivot was underway. Corporations began offloading the longevity risk, the inconvenient possibility that you might live too long onto the individual worker. The transition to the 401k was marketed as financial freedom, but in reality it was the privatization of risk. By the time we hit the current era of suburban pressure, the traditional finish line at age 65 had become a moving target. We are now witnessing the rise of the permanent worker, where retirement is no longer a destination but a luxury good that fewer can afford to purchase. The economy shifted from rewarding loyalty to rewarding market timing, leaving a generation to realize that their golden years might actually be platinum-plated years of continued labor. The collapse of the retirement dream was not a sudden explosion, but a slow-motion demolition of household balance sheets. As we entered the new millennium, the financial sector's shift toward deregulation turned the suburban home into a high-stakes ATM. Families facing stagnant real wages and the rising cost of college tuition began to view home equity as a fallback for their missing pensions. This created a profound asset-rich, cash-poor paradox. Households lived in million-dollar zip codes while possessing less than $5,000 in liquid savings. Credit card debt and second mortgages became the informal safety nets, masking a growing financial fragility. Meanwhile, the global savings glut suppressed interest rates, punishing those who tried to save conservatively and forcing retirees into the reach for yield in volatile equity markets. By the time the housing bubble began to hiss, the average American worker was walking a tightrope without a net. The privatization of retirement security meant that a single market correction didn't just hurt a portfolio, it canceled a decade of planned leisure. We moved from a society of savers to a society of speculators, where the ability to stop working depended entirely on the benevolence of the S&P 500 index. The triggering events of this crisis arrived with the subtlety of a heart attack. It wasn't just the collapse of a few subprime lenders, it was the total evaporation of confidence in the risk-free assets that backed the American retirement model. When the market crashed, the 401 became a 201 for millions of workers on the verge of 65. This psychological rupture sparked a liquidity freeze that felt personal. Families who had planned to downsize found their homes underwater, while their retirement accounts bled value in real time. The moment the ATM stopped being a magic box for equity was the moment the suburban pressure reached a boiling point. We witnessed a sudden loss of the wealth effect, where the feeling of being rich disappeared, replaced by a frantic recalculation of survival. The trigger was a realization that the safety nets, both formal and informal, were frayed beyond repair. As banks began to fail and credit lines were slashed, the ability to bridge the gap between a paycheck and a mortgage vanished. This was the era of the unspoken panic, where the professional class realized that the finish line had been moved out into the middle of the ocean and the tide was coming in. The impact on financial institutions was a masterclass in systemic irony. Banks that had spent years marketing financial independence to the middle class were suddenly the ones needing a bailout to remain independent themselves. The credit crunch that followed was absolute. The very institutions that encouraged leverage now viewed the suburban borrower as a toxic liability. As stock markets plummeted, the institutional memory of stable growth was replaced by a survivalist instinct. This paralysis meant that refinancing the traditional escape hatch for the American homeowner was slammed shut. The bailouts created a deep-seated cultural resentment, as the too-big-to-fail elite were rescued with taxpayer funds, while the too-small-to-matter retirees watched their nest eggs vanish. For the financial sector, the crisis was a balance sheet problem solved by government intervention. For the American worker, it was a biological problem. You cannot bail out a 60-year-old's lost decade of compound interest. The crunch forced a radical deleveraging that wasn't a choice but a mandate, leaving financial institutions more stable but the average suburban household more precarious than ever before. In the real economy, the suburban pressure manifested as a quiet, desperate contraction of the American lifestyle. Unemployment didn't just hit the factory floor. It climbed the stairs to the executive suite, targeting workers in their 50-seconds and 60-seconds who were suddenly too expensive for a lean, post-crisis world. We saw a precipitous decline in GDP and consumption as the silent decline took hold. Households began practicing lifestyle compression, trading the luxury SUV for a 10-year-old sedan and skipping the out-of-state college for the local community college. The effects on the household were multi-generational. Young adults moved back into their childhood bedrooms, creating a sandwich generation of 60-somethings, supporting both aging parents and struggling children. This era saw the death of the lifestyle milestone. Weddings were delayed, home repairs were ignored, and the once vibrant suburban strip mall became a graveyard of for-lease signs. The real economy wasn't just shrinking, it was aging. The workforce was becoming grayer, not because of a sudden passion for labor, but because the alternative was a poverty that the manicured lawns of the suburbs were never designed to accommodate. The government and Federal Reserve response was a massive experiment in reflating a punctured balloon. Monetary policy entered the twilight zone of 0% interest rates and quantitative easing, effectively a trillion-dollar adrenaline shot to the heart of the global banking system. While fiscal stimulus packages and rescue programs managed to prevent a second Great Depression, they did little to address the underlying retirement gap. In fact, by suppressing interest rates, the Fed inadvertently punished the very savers they were trying to help. For the person trying to retire on the interest of their savings, the Fed's policy was a slow-motion wealth transfer to the equity markets. The rescue was top-down, meaning that while the S&P 500 eventually recovered to record highs, the suburban pressure on property taxes, healthcare, and education continued to climb. The Fed could print money, but it couldn't print a lower cost of living or a more secure healthcare system for a 6'4" The response saved the system but left the individual to fend for themselves in a world where the only way to beat inflation was to stay in the labor market for an extra decade. The crisis was an American export that the rest of the world neither ordered nor wanted. As the U.S. consumer retreated, the global consequences were felt from the manufacturing hubs of Asia to the industrial heartlands of Europe. Global trade plummeted as the American dream stopped buying imported goods on credit. The U.S. housing collapse triggered a sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone, revealing that the suburban pressure in Ohio was inextricably linked to the fiscal stability of Greece and Italy. The world learned that the American retiree was the primary engine of global demand, and when that engine stalled, the entire assembly line ground to a halt. This global synchronization of misery highlighted the fragility of our interconnected markets. Emerging economies that had banked on a permanent American middle class were forced to pivot, while international markets faced a flight to quality that ironically drove up the value of the U.S. dollar, making American exports even more expensive. The world realized that the retirement gap wasn't just a domestic policy issue. It was a systemic risk to the global order, proving that when America stops planning for the future, the rest of the world pays the price. The lessons learned from this era are written in the fine print of every 401 statement. Regulatory reforms like Dodd-Frank attempted to build a fortress balance sheet for banks, but the retirement gap remains a wide-open chasm. The most significant long-term impact is the permanent shift in the American labor force. The 65-plus demographic is now the fastest growing segment of workers. We have entered a period of refined fragility, where the risks of future crises are buried in rising healthcare costs and the relentless inflation of the survival bucket: housing, taxes, and medical care. The historical echoes of 1972's stagflation are loud, as workers find that even with a job, they cannot outrun the cost of living. Policy responses have remained fragmented, focusing on access to retirement plans rather than the adequacy of those plans. The long-term effect is a two-tier retirement system, a secure early exit for the asset-rich, and a precarious permanent work cycle for everyone else. The suburban pressure has fundamentally altered the American psyche. We no longer ask when we will retire, but if the world as we know it will allow us to stop moving before our bodies do. Survival in this high-cost landscape has given birth to a new era of suburban MacGyverism. Workers are engaging in geographic arbitrage, selling the expensive coastal home to buy a cheaper life in the Sunbelt, only to find that property taxes and insurance premiums are following them south. We see the rise of house hacking, where the spare bedroom once reserved for grandkids is now listed on a short-term rental app to cover the property tax bill. Financial engineering is no longer for Wall Street. It's a dinner-table conversation about Roth conversions and HELOC strategies. Political mobilization has shifted from national ideologies to the hyper-local, a desperate fight over zoning, school funding, and the SALT cap. This is the asset-rich, cash-poor family's last stand, clinging to the equity in their home as if it were a life raft. The satire of the modern suburb is that everyone looks like they are winning, but everyone is one medical emergency or one property tax hike away from total liquidation. Survival now means working a consulting gig at 70, not for the passion of the craft, but for the coverage of the premium. As the documentary draws to a close, we are left with a landscape that looks familiar but feels entirely different. The suburban street remains quiet, the lawns are still green, and the lights are still on, but the social contract that built these neighborhoods has been shredded. The retirement gap has transformed 65 into the new 40, a midpoint in a professional life that no longer has a clear exit ramp. We are a nation of marathon workers who were told the race was 26 miles, only to find at the finish line that it's actually an ultramarathon. The regional divergence is sharpening, creating gated regions of retirees and labor colonies of those who must keep working to survive. The sustainability of this model is the great unanswered question of our time. As the sun sets over the cul-de-sac, we see the true face of modern American resilience. It's not a gold watch or a pension check. It's a 6-8-year-old checking their laptop at 11 p.m. to ensure they can stay in the house they've already paid for twice. The suburban pressure is the new normal, and the survival strategy is simply to never stop moving.